Welcome to the Air Hill Church Sermon Podcast. We hope and pray that the following teaching blesses you.
Well, if you have a child, a grandchild, a cousin, a niece or nephew, or maybe you're a little one that's hanging out with us today, you probably have a moment or two each year when you have the opportunity to receive a gift. Maybe it's during a holiday, maybe it's your birthday, maybe it's a certain family tradition. I live really far from my immediate and extended family of origin, and so we see them about once or twice a year, and so it's not really, there's gifts, but they're not really kind of any occasion. It's just like, oh, we thought of you, I thought you'd like to try this weird snack, that's where I kind of get it from, you know, or oh, I saw this card or this t-shirt, we kind of exchange gifts, right? But I was thinking back to that first moment when I bought Jeremiah, my son, a gift, and he was old enough to kind of really get it. Like, oh my gosh, this was picked out for me by my dad. And maybe you've been there if you have a young person in your life, and you give the gift. Maybe it's wrapped neatly. It is if I ask Hannah to do it. If not, I kind of just wrap one half and put the unwrapped side by the wall. It's a great surprise for everyone. And then Jeremiah opens it and he's excited. He says, thank you. He hugs and kisses me. But then I notice an hour later, 2 hours later, the toy, the book, it's not to be found. But he is fascinated by the box and the wrapping. Like he has made a mini fort for his Lego figurines with the box that I just so happened to grab from campus. It wasn't even related to the gift, and I'm sure it's on his 5th iteration of its life. Have you ever been there? Yeah. Even recently, this week, he was doing some of his household family responsibility chores, and there was a pause in what I would call his chore productivity. It was just a kind way to say he had stopped doing what we'd asked him to do. And I looked over why. It's because he had turned the empty paper towel holder into a telescope or monocular. And I was like, dude, it is time for dinner. And just please move that away from your eye, recycle that, and let's get this show on the road. He was fascinated with kind of the wrapping, the extra thing, the secondary thing. The book of James is really speaking to some of this because not only is our theme unpacking or unwrapping the gifts of James, we learned last week from Pastor Brenda that every good and perfect gift comes from above. But in actuality, the passage we'll talk about today and the theme that we'll see throughout the entire book is actually that James, the brother of Jesus, wants to make sure that people don't get distracted with the labels, the exterior, the secondary things of the Christian faith, and miss out on the robust living that is available to them. He says it in the passage that we'll read today, but to give you a sneak peek, he says to be not only hearers of the word, but to be doers of the word. And then he gets really serious and he says, because if you just hear and you don't do, you're going to deceive yourselves. So he's trying to say, hey, there's some gifts that you've been given, but if you just go to a worship service for an hour a week, if you just take the wrapping paper of being called a Christian, that's how you identify at work or on social media with family, but you're not actually doing the stuff that makes the gift full, the gift itself, love and grace and peace, receiving it towards yourself and then towards others, you're missing out. You might have the right language, but you don't have the right substance. If you think that our culture is an interesting mix of politics and religion and civic duty, magnify that times 10 in this 1st and 2nd century Middle Eastern Jewish context. It would be possible that you would know the right facts and know when to show up, when to sit down, when to shake a hand. You'd know the right words. You'd have the verses memorized. Most young boys had at least the first 2 or 3 books of the Bible memorized. And yet, there's a whole new set of books in the New Testament helping people to live out what they know. In a Hebrew understanding of knowledge, and why we talk about apprenticing or being an apprentice to Jesus, is because it's both receiving and doing. It's being hands-on. It's like those classes in undergrad that I didn't always enjoy because I had to make sure I was on my A game. There was 9 people in the room. We'd had to read hundreds of pages, and then we were having live discussions about how to apply that to a specific issue or problem. That was unlike the 200-person history lectures that I took that were introductory level, where I didn't necessarily have to do the reading. I could just sit and listen with a hidden headphone under my hand and listen to sports talk radio if I chose. I'm not saying I did that. I'm just saying it was possible to do that. And because the class was so big, it was really just a transfer of fact. But the Christian faith is about a lived, embodied apprenticeship. It's why you may have heard this before, that good students were said to have the dust of their rabbi's sandals on their own feet. That they would walk so closely that they would have walked the same path. Not that they would talk the same, although that would probably happen as well, but that they would live the same. If you ever had a chance to see me when I was ministering at American University, there was a small stretch of time where me and some of the other guys on our discipleship team, these would be staff and students, kind of all looked the same. Some of the students on campus said we all kind of looked like reject youth pastors. You know, we had like skinny jeans and white tennis shoes and the same haircut and kind of funky statement glasses. And we all carried around black journals because that was like really hip at the time. And it was a marker of potential cultural discipleship, in that the person who I admired in the faith looked and did that, and then someone saw me and looked, and it didn't necessarily mean that the substance was being transferred, but it did mean something was being transferred. The unfortunate reality in an area like Vienna, Virginia, or Virginia as a whole, is that all of the facts have been transferred. Very few people grew up and live in Virginia that have no idea who this Jesus person is. They might know him as the precursor to a curse word. They might know him as something to avoid at family dinner topics, or wherever you were forced to go at your private school to a chapel service. But there's a knowledge. But the question is there an embodied living? James is writing to the 12 tribes that are scattered, and by extension, you and I, to help them mature in their faith, so that faith is more than just facts. So that faith is a story that they have an opportunity to live into. In James, where we're going to be reading today, it's an important part of the story, and it's one of the most well-known passages in James. So we're at chapter 1, verses 19 through 27. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Here's what I referenced earlier. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at their face in a mirror. And after looking at themselves, they go away and immediately forget what they look like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they've heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The Bible often requires extensive study and understanding to try to get at what the author meant, what were the customs at the time, how were different audiences engaging with the words of different writers empowered by the Spirit. And sometimes there's a lot of gray in Scripture. The interesting thing about today is that there is not much gray. We don't need to jump into the Hebrew or Greek. We don't need to pull out a lot of commentaries or concordances. We can, but they are not going to necessarily help us shift from the gray. This is a type of passage that G.K. Chesterton says we either submit and obey or we do not. Because it's so clear. James does not pull punches. Pastor Brendan mentioned it in her introduction. He's writing both a type of literature that's called a general epistle, because it's not written to one specific church like Corinthians. So it's not a pastoral epistle, it's a general epistle. We see that in the first few verses, but it's also likened to wisdom literature because of its short, pithy sayings and phrases. We're familiar with wisdom literature in Proverbs, in Ecclesiastes. Many put Song of Songs in that category. But then also the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount are wisdom literature. It's a style. It's the way in which you would understand kind of the genre of communication. I mean, this is so convicting. And one of the benefits of either preaching through the lectionary or preaching and teaching through a verse-by-verse study is that I don't have the option to avoid difficult passages. And then I also am responsible to teach passages that may or may not be fully embodied in my own life. Like if you looked up, me online, or I have a business card, I'm not sure it would be honest if it said on there, Blane Young, assistant pastor, campus missionary, he is quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. I mean, that would be like a false advertising, I think, and that's why we're all kind of laughing, my wife included, because that may not necessarily be my greatest giftings, but that is what I am called to. Whether it's in connection or alignment with my personality doesn't really matter. It's what I'm called to. It's what you're called to. And I love that verse 20 gives us the why. Why? Because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. And then it says, get rid of moral filth and evil that's prevalent. Humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. And then we're invited to participate. Do not merely listen to the word, because you'll deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Martin Luther, the great reformer, many scholars after him have at times struggled with how do we navigate the seemingly obvious tension between the writings of James, the brother of Jesus, and the writings of Paul. James seems to say, show me your faith by your works. Paul seems to say, we are saved by faith, not by works. But they're both in the same library of Scripture. How do we navigate that difficulty? Especially if we're not willing to say that there are contradictory principles or doctrines in the Bible. Well, one way that we can approach this humbly and carefully is that James is not saying that our actions cause us to have valid faith, or even spark our faith to begin with, but that the actions of believers authenticate the faith that Jesus has given them. Some of the most precious doctrines of the belief about who Jesus is and what he has done come from the book of James, even though it's not as doctrinally based as, say, the book of Romans. It's not that James has a different picture than Paul. It's that James is trying to make a different point than Paul. James is trying to help us, help his original audience understand that as believers we're called to continual transformation and maturity, and that does not happen by more knowledge acquisition. Pastor and mentor of mine in Justice's, Mark, he would say this, that many of us are educated far beyond the level of our current obedience. He also says, if you've met someone that's been following Jesus, and maybe they said they converted or responded to an altar call 30 years ago, it's one thing if they've matured for 30 years, and another thing if they've lived year one of the Christian life just 30 times over and over. Are they a 30-year-old or are they a 1-year-old? Because especially in our American, Western, informationally driven, technological age, we can assume that information is key. And certainly information matters. But what we do with that information is the test of maturity and wisdom. I mean, I meet and work with college students all the time that are spending a lot of their own money, scholarship money, their parents' money, the government's money, future money in the form of debt to take classes. I don't know if you guys know this, but I haven't told them yet that most of that information is available at libraries and on YouTube. I haven't had the chance to tell them that. And it actually wouldn't be helpful because they are there to learn in a specific environment, to make certain relational connections, and to practice doing the work. Like I had like full sets of like those, I don't know if you, Justice, if you would know what they are, but imagine like everything you could Google printed out in a book. It was called an encyclopedia. I don't know if you ever heard of that, Justice, but some of us in the room, we've heard of those. And I used to have a stack in my bedroom. And what's crazy is that like I could have gotten all the information to perform surgeries from those documents. My parents still, though, didn't trust me with a scalpel, let alone a butter knife, because I didn't have the practice. The embodiment, the being a student. I might have had access to the knowledge, but even now employers are saying, particularly of Gen Z students, that they might have access to greater tools, but their problem-solving skills are at an all-time low because they've been trained to look for an answer elsewhere, not necessarily to figure out how to implement the answer on their own. A friend of mine, Charles Lee, wrote a book called Good Idea, Now What? And he's a consultant, and he mostly has made his money helping Fortune 500 companies and nonprofits, NGOs, move from idea to execution. And he says when he works with churches, every church basically has the same idea. They all just have different ways of approaching the execution. Especially if they're a Christian church. It's kind of like we've got the same book, same rule book, same plan, same idea. There's this guy Jesus that we all really like. We want other people to like him, and yet churches look and feel and sound different. And he would say part of it has to do with culture, part of it has to do with the practices or behaviors of execution. Justin Early says that our habits are actually micro-liturgies that form our lives and our communities. Charles Lee says when he works with churches, he's found that churches that talk about evangelism often sometimes end up doing the least amount of evangelistic efforts in their community because they talk about it so much that they've unintentionally deceived themselves, James is writing, to think psychologically that they've already done the work. It's kind of like why on social media I like to post the goals that I'm doing, even if I haven't already completed the goals, because it gives me the positive feedback without the cost. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying that's like why I have that habit. Like I'll announce something on social media. Like, oh, I'm writing this resource. Oh, I'm doing this because then I'll get the affirmation, the feedback, without necessarily having done the work or having taken up the effort. Thank you, Eric, for grabbing that. Charles Lee says that when he works with for-profit companies, he's filled with a lot of smart people that are dreamers, particularly in the startup space. They can raise money, they have great vision, but the question is, can they consistently do the thing they said they're going to do? As I have thought through how students mature in their faith, there's two things that come to mind. One is that in my experience, students in campus ministry, even if they've just come to Christ, typically become really great student leaders and lead others to Christ when they move from receiving ministry to being a participant of doing ministry with others. My friend Toby would say it like this, members mature through ministry. It's kind of like if you ever have to teach something to a class, you learn it better than if you had just been the student. I feel like half the time my students, even at an institution as rigorous and as elite, or as Forbes calls it, the new Ivy of Georgetown, is that they spend half their time listening to their professors teach and half the time hearing other students teach the content that they've learned. Because that helps them make better learners by embodying it and living it. The other thing that I would notice is that students mature and become leaders when they recognize that the whole story of their life can be a place to receive and give grace. Not just their 1-hour leadership meeting, 1-hour Thursday night, Sunday morning commitment, but when they start to view their whole life as an opportunity to be loved and to give love, to receive the kingdom and to give opportunities for people to taste the kingdom. At the very end of this passage, we see a really stark juxtaposition. Worthless religion and faultless religion. According to James, worthless religion are people, groups, institutions that consider themselves religious but do not have a tight rein on their tongue. As someone who enjoys comedy, I fancy myself a funny individual in person. These verses, the verses in Scripture that say, hey, be careful not to give yourself to coarse joking, lift each other up, do not put each other... I take those very seriously because at times I haven't always lived into that and other people have paid the cost of that. We can open any news source, any social media site, and we can see people who consider themselves religious and do not have a tight rein on their tongues. From any world religion. An unreined tongue in any topic. According to James, their religion is worthless. If you're upset about that, I will give you James's email address in heaven one day. No need to bother Pastor Brenda on vacation or even email me this week. It's okay. This is James with the strong language. I'm just passing it along. But then we find out, well, what is it on the flip side? Well, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless. Faultless religion is if you look after orphans and widows and then keep yourself from being polluted by the world. Do we care for those that are marginalized and in need? Not just knowing that they exist, but doing something about it. But also, do we keep ourselves from being polluted by the world? I think that has a little bit more to do with our engagement with the world around us than it does what choices we make in the media that we consume. Although those are important choices because what you behold, you become. What you allow in actually ends up forming within you. But in this context, it seems that the pollution of the world that James was dealing with were people that were hearing but not doing, that were claiming to be religious but did not have a tight rein on their tongues, that were ignoring the needs of the orphans and the widows, and that also were angry and lacked humility. That was the pollution he was fighting against. Because there is that pollution that can take place in our hearts. If we have been recipients of grace, we can unintentionally become entitled and think that we have grace because we're better than. So he's not saying to view yourself as better than or have an us-them mindset. He is saying have differentiated wholeness and holiness. To be in the world but not of the world. To be for the world. Notice that our slogan, our motto is here for good. It's not here for good for church members. Here for good for people that attend our church. Here for good for those that respect our parking lot and only use it when they're supposed to. Sorry, that was just something personally I'm working through with the Lord. Here for good for our community. It's not here for good for those that vote like us, think like us, look like us. It's here for the good of Vienna. We see in Ezra, we see in Nehemiah that God's prophetic call, even in a pre-Jesus existence, is that God's people would exist not only for their own flourishing, but for the flourishing of others. And I would argue that we only truly flourish when others flourish around us. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. As many of you know, I'm preparing this summer to transition to work here full-time, and I'm really excited for what that means for our family, for me personally, to invest in you, to work alongside you, to continue to learn from you, and to lead in this context, but to also explore and dream and work and do good in the community around us. But after 15 years, I think that how I've impacted students most at American University at Georgetown is by being someone willing to accompany them in moments of celebration and in moments of difficulty. Very few students or my alum remember any sermons I've given, small groups I've led, DNA group resource talks, retreats I've facilitated, but many of them, if they were here, would remember how I might have, as imperfect as I am, shown up for them in a moment of celebration or pain. That I was quick to listen, slow to speak, and even when they made mistakes or broke the rules or rebelled, I was slow to become angry. That is connected with the righteousness that God desires, and it's the call not just for campus ministers, not just for assistant pastors at churches, but for all of us. Because the world is full of people like you and I that are grappling with a lot of things, some hidden, some unseen. I've never met a single person that says, you know what, you've bothered me because you've listened too much. You've not given me enough advice or Christian cliches. You have been too slow when you've gotten angry with me, and I don't know if we can be friends anymore. No, our world is starved for listeners and people willing to accompany. The question is, will we not just hear the word that that's what we should do, but will we find small ways to live that out together this week? Would you stand with me as I pray?
We are rooted in kindness. We practice patience with the path, and we experience transformation. We are Air Hill Church.